Hi, I'm Erik Jones, and you're listening to Verse by Verse. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at one of the many parables of Jesus Christ. Now, a parable is simply a short fictional story that teaches a moral lesson, very similar to a modern-day fable. This was one of Jesus' favorite teaching methods. Parables allowed him to teach spiritual lessons in a way that the full meaning could only be understood by those he specifically intended to understand it. The rest would simply hear a nice story, but not really get the spiritual value out of it. The parable we'll look at today is found in the first 8 verses of Luke chapter 18. Before getting into the spiritual lesson behind it, we'll read the parable straight through. We'll begin Jesus' parable here in Luke 18 verse 2. There was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him, saying, "Get justice for me from my adversary." And he would not for a while, but afterward he said within himself, "Though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me." And that's it. That's the parable. It's actually very simple. There are only 2 characters, a judge and a widow. Now, the judge didn't respect God or man, and thus had really no interest in helping or advocating for this widow because she had nothing to offer him. But because the widow persistently and consistently asked, the judge eventually gave in and gave her justice. The conclusion is very simple. Because of her persistence, she eventually wore him out and he granted her justice, primarily to get her off his back, as the saying goes. So what lesson did Jesus want us to learn from this very short, simple parable? Thankfully, this is one of the parables that Jesus followed up with an explanation. So let's let him explain it in his words in verses 6 through 8. Then the Lord said, "Hear what the unjust judge said. And shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on earth?" So Christ makes it fairly clear that the unjust judge in the parable represents God the Father. This leads us to a much bigger point about parables, something we need to keep in mind whenever we read them. We need to be very careful how we use parables, because if we took every aspect of this parable literally, we could conclude that Jesus is saying that the Father, God the Father, is unjust, since in the parable he's represented by the unjust judge. But of course that's not true at all. God the Father is a God of mercy and justice and is by no means unjust. The point is this: not every element of a parable should be taken literally. To understand the parable, or the lesson of the parable, we must zero in on the lesson and recognize that there will be some details that aren't meant to be taken literally. In this case, the judge being unjust serves the story because that's what provoked the widow to be persistent. Had the judge been just, he would have avenged her case immediately, and the lesson of persistence would have been completely lost. So again, with every parable, we have to zero in on the core lesson and extract it from the parts of the parable that are simply story. So now let's come back to the parable and focus on the lesson we're supposed to learn. Luke actually introduced the parable in Luke 18 verse 1 by providing a very solid synopsis of Jesus' lesson. Luke 18 verse 1. Then he spoke a parable to them that men always ought to pray and not lose heart. So those are the 2 essential lessons we're to learn from this parable. Number 1, always pray about our needs. In other words, be persistent. God doesn't get irritated when we bring our concerns to him in prayer more than once. He wants us to be like that widow and continually and faithfully pray for his intervention. Now, at some point we will receive his answer and then can transition from being a persistent requester to a persistent thanker. But until then, it's not wrong to continue bringing our needs to God in a spirit of respect and faith. And second, we're told not to lose heart. In other words, don't get discouraged. The widow didn't. Sometimes when God doesn't answer our prayers immediately in the way that we want him to, we can become discouraged and become disillusioned. We can think he doesn't care about us or that he's uninterested or maybe simply isn't even listening. So the parable warns us, don't go there. Don't lose heart. Don't get discouraged. Don't give up on God. And never go down the mental path of thinking He's given up on you. Instead, continually and faithfully put your needs into His hands, respectfully recognizing His right to answer in the time and way He sees fit. Of course, that's why we should always pray and ask for His will to be done. Praying and thinking like this is one of the keys to being a faithful person. And faithful people are who He is looking for on this earth. And as He said in His explanation of the parable, those who He will reward when He returns. So hopefully this short but powerful parable will benefit your Christian walk, particularly your prayer life. Let's summarize the key takeaways like this. Number 1, faithfully take your concerns and needs to God. Number 2, be respectfully persistent. And number 3, don't get discouraged. That is the essential spiritual lesson Jesus wants us to learn from the parable of the persistent widow.
Verse by Verse is a companion podcast to the Daily Bible Verse blog, which you can find on the Life, Hope, and Truth Learning Center. Check out the show notes for more.